Thanks for joining us. And today we're going to talk about which Kriya Yoga school is the best. So there are many Kriya Yoga schools out there, and many of them claim to be teaching the original teachings of Kriya Yoga or the most powerful teachings of Kriya Yoga and so on. And we have these different lineages. We have the monastic lineage, kind of, if you will, or one of the monastic lineages that came through Paramahansa Yogananda and included self-realization fellowship and so on and so on. And that has branched out as well. You have Ananda, who was Swami Ananda, and he founded his own particular version of Kriya based on Yogananda's teachings at the time. And then you also have Eugene Davis, who also learned Kriya Yoga from Yogananda and was authorized basically to teach it and became a guru in his own right, in his own sort of path. When Yogananda was around, there was also Hariharananda, who was a colleague of his, if you will, and ended up teaching Kriya Yoga in the States, but had learned from Shri Yukteswar, who was Yogananda's teacher, and taught Kriya Yoga, and then kind of went on his own direction and started to experiment with Kriya, come with a different perspective on Kriya. You have the more traditional kind of approaches in Kriya Yoga within the actual Lahiri family as well, that came from Lahiri's sons and his grandsons, and Satyacharan Lahiri, and then Ashok Chatterjee as well was his student that came from that. And so then there's also Panchanan Bhattacharya, right, who was the preeminent disciple of Lahiri Baba, and he had his own kind of lineage, and so there was lots of branches, right? And so often there's a thought about which, if there's so many branches of Kriya Yoga, which branch is the best? And then the assumption is it's the original one, it must be the original one. But the thing is that most people don't realize is that Lahiri Baba actually started teaching, when he started teaching Kriya, he put more of an emphasis on certain types of techniques, and later in his life he put emphasis on other techniques, right? So it was maybe a result of his changing perceptions on what worked the best. Now we know that with Lahiri Baba's students, it wasn't a cookie cutter approach to Kriya Yoga, right? So he didn't teach everybody the same way. He gave people the kind of practices that he knew was going to help them. So we know the Kriya Pranayam, right, which is the foundational aspect of Kriya, which is sometimes called the first initiation or the first chapter of Kriya. Is really about trying to get into Prachihara. It's using Pranayam, right, this life force control through intentional breathing. It's using that to get into Prachihara, which is internalization, right? And we know in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras that getting into Prachihara is really important, right? So with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, they talk about sort of after the yama and niyama, the moral do's and don'ts, then you have asana, right, which is a posture, a stable posture for meditation. And then you start to do pranayam, right, this intentional breathing, life force control through intentional breathing. And from that, you get into Prachihara, which is internalization. You want to start to go within, right? That's a necessary stage in yoga into going into meditation, is that Prachihara. And so, the first aspect really in looking at the different Kriya Yoga schools and trying to make a decision on which one you want to follow and so on, is to seeing how effective they are with the Prachihara process, right? So from my perspective at Modern Kriya, we teach Kriya Yoga in the Panchanan Bhattacharya lineage of Kriya Yoga. And really the emphasis is that you should be getting into Prachihara relatively quickly, right? So there are some Kriya Yoga schools where it seems to take a long time to get into Prachihara. And when I used to study Yogananda's teachings, right, and the particular Kriya taught in Self-Realization Fellowship, it would take me a long time to get into Prachihara. So personally, I found that to be not very effective. Other people disagree with me, right? And that's fine. If it's working for you, great, right? But really you wanted to get into Pratyahara quickly. And if you're not getting into Pratyahara quickly, then, maybe it's not as effective as you had hoped. So it's not really about the school as about the technique. Does it work for you, right? There are some people that are really devotionally inclined, and so a path like self-realization fellowship and having that bhakti and having a community and singing together and all that between meditation periods and so on really works for them. From my perspective, it doesn't, because what I want to do is to be able to get into Prachihara quickly. I think that's what Lahiri wanted us to do. He wanted us to get into Prachihara, right? To get into dharana, right? The concentration, internalized void. He wanted to get us into absorption, dhyana, right? He wanted people to have experience of the tranquil breath, right? Which is sometimes called the breathless state. Just so people know that there's these, as I said, Lahiri started teaching one way in his life and then kind of went in a different direction a little bit. First major phase that Lahiri was teaching, the emphasis he was putting on was kumbhaka, right? Kumbhaka is breath retention, so holding your breath. So we know that in Kriya Yoga, one of the ways that most people in the first chapter or initiation of Kriya learn is they use yoni mudra, right? Of holding the breath in a particular way. And at Modern Kriya, being informed by a neuroscience approach, we know that kumbhaka gets us into what we call a blood pressure variability. So it means that our blood pressure rises and falls, right? And by using this sort of intentional breathing in a strategic way with breath holds, you can get into a low idle state, right? Nudging yourself towards the tranquil breath, to this sort of breathless state, right? So the kumbhaka was something that Lahiri talked about, and so that people would be holding their breath for a very long time while they're doing pranayam, right? And then at some point he kind of moved away from that. Now, I know that there are some people that are, there are some types of kumbhaka techniques in Kriya Yoga that taught sort of in the kumbhaka schools, if you will, right? Where people are holding their breath for a very, very, very long time. And some people have said, like, you need to do like upwards of like 200 repetitions of this breath holding type of Kriya and so on. And that's all fine and good. But the thing is, if you are doing your Kriya effectively and you do some moderate kumbhaka, you will get into the tranquil breath. And then holding the breath is no longer necessary, right? You don't need to do pranayam. So there are some schools that are saying basically like you need to be doing these 200 repetitions of this very sort of strenuous kumbhaka practice. But if you're getting into the tranquil breath before that, you don't need to be doing 200 repetitions of the kumbhaka, right? Of a particular kumbhaka technique in Kriya. So you don't need that, right? What you want to do is to start to build your body's response, right? So, and you're stimulating or activating your parasympathetic nervous system. So you want it to become predominant. And what it does, the parasympathetic nervous system, it's like the brake in the nervous system, right? So the sympathetic is like the gas pedal, if you will, and the parasympathetic is like the brake. And Kriya Pranayam, if done in a way that is effective, it stimulates what we call the dorsal vagal complex, which is a nerve that runs along the anterior part of your spine. And when you stimulate it with a long exhalation, right, and you bring your breath below a certain threshold, which is 7 breaths per minute, you get into heart rate variability, right, which is this variability in the way that your heart works, and it starts to stimulate the medulla oblongata, which is in your brainstem, which then basically signals your body to slow your heart rate, right? So Kriya is working in a predictable scientific way, if you will, for lack of a better term, to slow down your heart rate, right? And so when you slow down your heart rate and your breath is slowing too, and you're starting to get into that low idle state, and then you start to introduce kumbhaka in a moderate way, right, of holding your breath, you start to build up CO2 tolerance, right? So holding your breath means that you can retain CO2 within without needing to gasp for breath. And so that CO2 tolerance starts to nudge you towards the tranquil breath. And then your breath starts to shallow out, and then it disappears, right? You're still breathing, but it's very, very shallow, and you get into the tranquil breath. At that point, there's no need to do kumbhaka, right? And there's no need to continue to do Kriya Pranayam, right? You're just not needed. It's like you're not breathing. You are, but it's very, very slight. So really, excessive kumbhaka practice isn't really needed. It's good to do in the beginning with training, right? So you're training yourself in these things, right? Just like with Kriya Pranayam, you're training your body to get into the Prachihara and into a low idle state. That's what you want to do, right? But you want to train yourself to get into it quickly. You don't want to be doing, well, I need to do 144 Kriyas twice a day, every day, because that's the way that I'm burning up my karma. That kind of thinking, like, it takes you away from the actual experience, right? So that's why we say, you know, you don't have to do that many Kriya, but you want to do the Kriya to make it effective. I think it was Yogananda speaking to Kriyananda at the time, and Kriyananda's like, oh, I did like 1,000 Kriya. And then Yogananda's like, well, you know, you don't need to do 1,000 Kriya, you just need to do one, you know, a few Kriya right? You want to get the effect. It's not about the form, it's not about your training plan and the number of repetitions, it's how the effect of those repetitions on you. You want to be getting into Prachihara, right? Which kind of explains to me why Lahiri Baba actually moved away from the Kumbhaka focus later on in his life and started to focus on other types of Kriya, right? Different Kriyas that get you internalized in the energy centers in different parts of the body, right? So he started to shift away from that holding the breath, because likely he had, you know, for him, I'm sure that he would get into the tranquil breath like at the drop of a hat probably, and then be in this sort of breathless state and then move into a deeper kind of inner perceptions, inner pranayam that doesn't require breath retention because you're in the tranquil breath. And that seems to be why he shifted into teaching some of the other later techniques that don't require kumbhaka for the most part. So those practices, the emphasis on those later non-kumbhaka techniques, if you will, became more what he carried to his sons, right? So his sons passed that on to his grandsons and so on, and so you have the emphasis of those particular practices. Now in the Panchanan Bhattacharya lineage that I'm part of, it includes all of those. So it includes the Kumbhaka school and then those other practices. And so, you know, from my perspective, having all of those is really good because it's really like a spiritual toolkit, if you will. Your Kriya toolkit. You've got a variety of practices to apply at any particular instance in your meditation so you can get the biggest leverage, right? Because you know what you need. So, you know, you're learning the Kriya Pranayama initially, you're learning that to get into Prachihara. Everyone should be doing that, right? But then some of the other techniques as well, you know, once you get into the tranquil breath, there's no longer a need to do those other sort of Kumbhaka focused breath retention. And so you can move on to different practices. So this is a good way to have a well-rounded Kriya yoga practice. So if you have any questions about this video, feel free to send me an email at info@modernkriya.com. Also check our website at modernkriya.com and our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.